Hello and welcome to my channel. Hope you're doing well out there today. This channel is for educational purposes. We try to tune you in, turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, and tour de forces from obscure sources. And these are things that you can believe in because they are holistic. They are an attempt to explain everything. And so you can apply them in your own life, in your own situations. You can use them for your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, including personal sovereignty and there was one other thing that I can't remember, but it's all good stuff. And today is our 30th day of covering the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And so I'm kind of elevating the Dead Sea Scrolls into one of these kind of cosmologies. When you look at the whole corpus, certainly the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a series of caves between 1947 and about 1956, 20 miles outside of Jerusalem in a place called Qumran, right at the Dead Sea, at the lowest elevation on the planet. And all told, there are like 800 different volumes, including every book of the Old Testament, except for Esther. Many of the Old Testament books were in multiple copies, 20 copies of Genesis and 22 copies of Isaiah or something, 30 copies of Psalms. And in addition, there's also a lot of sectarian material, poems, and a lot of procedural stuff from the sect there at Qumran, kind of like a monastery group that lived there. And they had rules and regulations, and they had, banter between each other and debates, and those are all written down. It's called sectarian material, and it turns out that that sectarian material is the most explosive stuff in the whole find, pretty much because the biblical translations are almost identical to the ones that we already know about, but also the sectarian material uses a lot of phrases, jargon, different kind of nicknames and things like that that are also repeated or similar to the same jargon that is in the New Testament, in the Gospels and Acts. And so there's certainly a lot of speculation that whoever wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls was in close contact with whoever wrote the Gospels. And that is something that was a little bit too close to home for the international team of scholars who were appointed to translate these, catalog and translate and disseminate these documents. And when they started to see what they were saying, they began to work on strategy of suppression and censorship and secrecy and hoarding. And so they pretty much started sitting on the stuff, all of the documents that they had access to, and not giving them to anybody else, not putting them out themselves. And next thing you know, it's been 35 years and nobody has got a clue what the Dead Sea Scrolls are about. Um, and that whole situation, which was covered in this book, in the earlier parts of this book, didn't really abate until Robert Eisenman and others got into the game and started threatening these people with legal action and so on in the early 1990s. And so nowadays the scrolls are out there, but very few people know too much about them. Whether your pastor or whoever is dissuading you from looking at them, or you just don't know about them, or you're daunted by their existence because there's so much of it that you don't really know where to start. So this book here is kind of a good contextualization of the whole event, and maybe will give you some ideas of where to go if you'd like to know more. Now, right now we're in a chapter here about Paul, and certainly they are along the same lines as I am here, with the suggestion that Paul may not have been who he claimed he was, and that he might have been working with the authorities from Rome. And so he went through some of the evidence earlier. Like I said yesterday, Paul is kind of just like a portable false flag operation. Wherever Paul goes, even as you read his story in Acts, wherever Paul goes, there follows some kind of insurrection. And it's usually an insurrection that gets put down and some Jews are punished. Paul gets away, usually with a protection from the Roman legions or the Roman guards. And he moves on to the next town and he does the same thing. So, you know, he is supposed to be there to be spreading the gospel, but he appears to be, especially in the way that Eisenman talks about it, as really opposing James, the Lord's brother, so-called, who is a Jew and is trying to promote the life of Jesus as a kind of a military leader and a person that can help us with our freedom to be free ourselves from this Roman yoke that we are under. But instead, Paul is, and to a great extent, Jesus, or at least according to Paul, is much more in favor of turning the other cheek and walking another mile with his pack, with the Roman legion's pack, and you know, not really pinning any of the blame on the Romans, but more on the Jews. And so that's kind of the context here. So we'll get started here right in the middle of chapter 15 or 16. Startling though the suggestion may be, it does seem at least possible that Paul was some species of Roman agent. Eisenman was led to this conclusion by the scrolls themselves, then found the references in the New Testament to support it. And indeed, if one combines and superimposes the materials found at Qumran with those in Acts, together with obscure references in Paul's letters, such a conclusion becomes a distinct possibility. But there is another possibility as well, possibly no less startling. Those last muddled and enigmatic events in Jerusalem, the nick-of-time intervention of the Romans, Paul's heavily escorted departure from the city, his sojourn in luxury at Caesarea, his mysterious and utter disappearance from the stage of history, these things find a curious echo in our own era. One is reminded of beneficiaries of the Witness Protection Program in the United States. One is also reminded of the so-called supergrass phenomenon in Northern Ireland. Again, this book was written back in the 1990s, so when he's talking about current events, you have to go back that far. In both cases, a member of an illicit organization dedicated to organized crime or to paramilitary terrorism is turned by the authorities. He consents to give evidence and testify in exchange for immunity, protection, relocation, and money. Like Paul, he would incur vengeful wrath of his colleagues. Like Paul, he would be placed under seemingly disproportionate military and or police protection. Like Paul, he would be smuggled out under escort. Having cooperated with the authorities, he would then be given a new identity and, together with his family, resettled somewhere theoretically out of reach of his vindictive comrades. So far as the world at large was concerned, he would, like Paul, disappear. Does Paul then belong in the company of history's secret agents, of history's informers and supergrasses? These are some of the questions generated by Robert Eisenman's research. But in any case, Paul's arrival on the scene set a train of events in motion that was to prove irreversible. What began as a localized movement within the framework of existing Judaism, its influence extending no further than the Holy Land, was transformed into something of a scale and magnitude that no one at the time can have foreseen. The movement entrusted to the early church and the Qumran community was effectively hijacked and converted into something that could no longer accommodate its progenitors. There emerged a skein of thought which, heretical at its inception, was to evolve in the course of the next 2 centuries into an entirely new religion. What had been heresy within the framework of Judaism was now to become the orthodoxy of Christianity. Few accidents of history can have had more far-reaching consequences. And I think as we move on with our research here, we will assure ourselves that this is no accident. But that is the end of that chapter, and I guess the end of the chapters as we are moving into the postscript. The story of the scrolls is, needless to say, unfinished. The plot, and this is in 1991, so it has played out, kept playing. But the documents are out there now, so the plot continues to unfold, taking new twists and turns. Much has happened since this book appeared in Great Britain in May 1991. By the autumn, things had built to a climax, and the scrolls were the subject of front-page coverage, as well as editorials in such newspapers as the New York Times. Even as the American edition of our book is being prepared for publication, other books and articles are appearing in print. Conferences are being convened. Media attention is intensifying. Various protagonists are issuing statements. In May, the Israeli Oversight Committee granted to Oxford University a complete set of photographs of all scroll material, and a Center for Scroll Research was established under the auspices of Giza Vermes. I guess they just made a typo there. Access, however, was still rigorously restricted, still denied to independent scholars. Interviewed on British television, Professor Norman Gold of the University of Chicago queried the purpose of such a center. Was it, he asked, simply to be a center of frustration? On September 5th, the American press reported that 2 scholars at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Professor Ben Zion Wacholder and one of his doctoral students, Martin G. Ebeg, had broken the monopoly of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Using the concordance prepared by the international team in the 1950s, they had then employed a computer to reconstruct the texts themselves. The results, said to be 80% accurate, were published by the Biblical Archaeology Society under Herschel Shanks. The surviving members of the international team were predictably furious. Professor Cross inveighed against piracy. What else would you call it? The deposed John Struniel fulminated. But stealing. On September 7th, however, an editorial in the New York Times endorsed Wacholder's and Abeg's action. Quote, some on the committee might be tempted to charge the Cincinnati scholars with piracy. On the contrary, Mr. Wacholder and Mr. Abeg are to be applauded for their work and for sifting through layer upon layer of obfuscation. The committee, with its obsessive secrecy and cloak and dagger scholarship, long ago exhausted its credibility with scholars and laymen alike. The two Cincinnatians seem to know what the Scroll Committee forgot, that the scrolls and what they say about the common roots of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism belong to civilization, not to a few sequestered professors. A more electrifying revelation was soon to follow. On September 22nd, the Huntington Library in California disclosed that it possessed a complete set of photographs of all unpublished scroll material. These had been entrusted to the library by Betty Bechtel of the Bechtel Corporation, who had commissioned them around 1961. Having learned of the photographs' existence, members of the international team had demanded them back. The Huntington had responded with defiance. Not only did the library make its possession of the photographs public, but it also announced its intention of making them accessible to any scholar who wished to see them. Microfilm copies were to be offered for as little as $10. When you free the scrolls, said William A. Moffett, the library's director, you free the scholars. Again, of course, members of the international team kicked up a rumpus, this time more petulant than ever. Again, there were charges of theft of scholarly work. One independent professor replied, however, that most people will regard the Huntington as Robin Hoods, stealing from the academically privileged to give to those hungry for knowledge. Amir Drori, head of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, accused the Huntington of sundry legal transgressions, even though the photographs had been taken long before the scrolls passed into Israeli hands as spoils of war. Megan Broshi, director of the Shrine of the Book, spoke darkly of legal action. The Huntington stood its ground. There's either freedom of access or not. Our position is that there should be unfettered access. By that time, release of the photographs was already a fait accompli, and any attempt to reverse the process would have been futile. It's too late, the Huntington declared. It's done. On September 25th, the Israeli government gave way, carefully distancing itself from Drori's and Broshi's pronouncements. Drori and Broshi were said to have been speaking as individuals, not as representatives of the Israeli government. Yuval Ne'eman, Israel's Minister of Science, issued a press statement asserting that, quote, every scholar should be granted free access to examine the scrolls and publish its findings. It is fortunate that this opportunity has now become feasible through public exposure of the scrolls' photographic collection by the Huntington Library. In the meantime, at 11:05 that morning, Robert Eisenman's name had gone down on record as that of the first scholar formally to request and obtain access to the Huntington's photographs of squirrel material. The battle for access had been won. There still remains, however, the process of dismantling the orthodoxy of interpretation promulgated for the last 40 years by the international team. By the time the events chronicled above had hit the headlines, Eisenman had begun to pursue his research on other fronts as well. In 1988, he had pointed out that the excavations at Qumran were far from complete, far from exhaustive. The surrounding terrain is, in fact, ideal for the preservation of manuscripts, and virtually all experts in the field agree that there are more discoveries to be made. It is not just possible, but probable that additional scroll material still exists, buried under landslides and rock falls. Many caves have yet to be excavated properly, that is, through the rubble of fallen roofs and down to bedrock. Other caves previously explored only by the Bedouin have to be explored anew, since the Bedouin tended to overlook some concealed documents and to leave behind many fragments, and in any case, officially sanctioned Bedouin excavations effectively ceased with the 1967 war. There are other sites in the general vicinity of Qumran that have yet to be thoroughly explored. 9 miles to the south, for example, on the shores of the Dead Sea, at a place called En El Guer, an Israeli archaeologist found Qumran-style graves and the ruins of a Qumran-style, albeit smaller, residence. It is certainly reasonable to suppose that the caves in the nearby wadis, hitherto unexcavated, may also be repositories for scrolls. With these facts in mind, Eisenman determined to embark on his own archaeological explorations. His primary objective was, of course, to look for additional scroll material. Such material might, as proved to be the case with the temple scroll, be entirely new. But even if it duplicated material already in the hands of the international team, it would render pointless any continued suppression. Quite apart from the prospect of additional scroll material, however, Eisenman wanted to build up as complete a picture as possible of the population in the entire region, from Qumran on south towards Masada. There might have been, he concluded, other Qumran-style communities. In consequence, he undertook to look for evidence of any other kind, evidence of water control, for example, such as terraces, aqueducts, and cisterns, which might have been constructed to sustain livestock and support agriculture. To date, Michael Beagent, one of the authors of this book, has accompanied Robert Eisenman and his team of archaeologists and volunteers on 2 exploratory expeditions in January 1989 and January 1990. In the first of them, they concentrated on the excavation of a cave roughly a mile south of Qumran, some 500 feet up the cliff. The cave opened into a series of chambers extending at least 80 feet back into the rock. Part of the interior had a smooth floor made of palm fronds and packed mud. No scrolls came to light, but a number of Iron Age remains were found, a juglet, an oil lamp, and uniquely an arrow shaft and arrowhead in perfect preservation after 3,000 years. The expedition proved, for the first time, that some, at least, of the caves around Qumran had been inhabited, not just used as temporary refuges during brief periods of danger, but occupied on a more permanent basis. The second expedition endeavored to explore as much as possible of the Dead Sea coast, south of Qumran, and the adjacent cliff face. The purpose of this undertaking was to compile an inventory of all hitherto unexplored caves that might warrant subsequent exhaustive excavation. Dividing itself into small teams, the expedition searched some 13 miles of cliff, rising precipitously as high as 1,200 feet. Apart from caves, there were found the remains of artificial terraces and walls, of constructions for water control and irrigation, all attesting to human inhabitation and cultivation. Altogether, 137 habitable caves were located and subjected to preliminary examination without excavation. Of these, 83 were deemed worthy of systematic excavation. They will become the focus of future archaeological activity. Of particular and revolutionary importance to any such activity will be a new system of high-tech ground radar known as subsurface interface radar. We had been discussing with Eisenman the likelihood of there being other caves in the vicinity of Qumran and along the shore of the Dead Sea, as well as of caves, rooms, cellars, passages, and other subterranean structures under the ruins of Qumran itself. DeVoe, the leader of the international team while he was alive, the only person to attempt any excavation of the actual site, never looked for anything of the sort, never really probed beneath the surface. Yet it is virtually unknown for a construction of the kind attested to by the Qumran ruins not to have underground chambers, passages, dungeons, and escape tunnels. It is generally acknowledged that something of the sort must indeed exist, but some fairly major excavations would be necessary, involving much trial and error and probably damage to the site. The prospect, therefore, of finding anything under Qumran seemed a priori doomed in advance by the magnitude of what would have been entailed. But in the autumn of 1988, we chanced on a newspaper article about a secret burial vault of possible relevance to Shakespearean scholars found under a church near Stratford-on-Avon. What interested us about this article was the fact that the vault had apparently been located by a species of underground radar scanning system operated by a firm based in the south of England. Possibilities offered by whatever it was called, it's subsurface interface radar, SIR, proved exciting indeed. It was a terrestrial equivalent of a ship-based sonar recording system. The apparatus was portable. When moved at a constant speed over the ground, it produced a computer-generated image of subterranean features. The image, in turn, was produced through the building up of a profile of interfaces, that is, points at which earth or rock or any other substance of density and solidity gave way to air. The entire system was thus ideal for locating underground caves and cavities. At the very least, it would register interfaces 30 feet below the surface. Under good conditions, it could penetrate as deep as 120 feet. The manager of the company that operated the radar proved keen to help. He had, it transpired, read and enjoyed the books we had previously published. The prospect of his equipment being employed at Qumran intrigued him. He even offered to come along on an expedition and operate the apparatus himself. As a result of this offer, Eisenman's 1990 expedition made a special point of noting sites warranting investigation by radar. We are now waiting for permission from the Israeli government to bring the equipment into the country and employ it at Qumran. Well, I'd be interested to find out what happened there. The Dead Sea Scrolls found in 1947 were not the first such ancient texts to come to light in the Judean desert. Indeed, there are reports of such texts being found as early as the 3rd century AD. The theologian Origen, one of the early church fathers, is alleged to have made one such discovery. According to the church historian Eusebius, Origen found several different versions of Old Testament texts, some of which had been lost for many years. He is said to have hunted them out of their hiding places and brought them to light. One version of the Psalms, we are told, was found at Jericho in a jar during the reign of Antoninus, son of Severus. This reference allows us to date the discovery to somewhere between 211 and 217 AD. Okay, I think we're going to stop there, and we might finish this book very soon. But we're going to stop there and take over at this spot tomorrow when we come back. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a